All right, good to see everybody this morning. Got a great number. Still have some coming in, and I guess some folks are dropping food off for the meal to come up after our worship hour. So we'll look forward to those coming in just a minute. I did put a new sheet on the back table for lesson number 8. And if you need a copy of lesson number 8, it is back there. Also, there's a copy of lesson 7, which we're doing right now in class today. And so if you need those notes as a way of sort of following where we're going, there's a small stack of those on the back table as well. But today we're in chapter 2. We're looking at verses 12 through 18 of Philippians chapter 2. So Philippians 2 beginning in verse 12. Obviously there's been a lot going on this week. We have a lot to be praying about. Of course we want to continue to pray for Carolyn and the struggles that she's having physically right now, and we pray that they can get all of the body systems regulated like they need to be, and she can start feeling better. So we hate that she's not feeling great and said the trouble that she's had in the hospital this week. Art and Gloria were on a cruise this week, and they went to Cozumel and Belize, and now they're back. My understanding was, human trafficking is a huge thing. Art was abducted in Cozumel, but they gave him back in Belize, and so here he is. He's back. Got a refund on that. Gloria put me up to that, by the way. She said, I told her, and she said, you need to say that in class, and so I will. But we're glad they're back, and apparently they had super heavy fog yesterday, and so they didn't get back until really late. The ship couldn't port right away, and so we're glad they're back safely. I know that's a long trip. Yeah. Right. We also, I'm sure several here know Leanne Day. Her and her husband visited a number of times. They were members at Saudi, and then they ended up members at Dunlap. They're very good friends of the Arnolds and several others in the congregation. And she did pass away, so we want to remember her family. She had a very aggressive form of stomach cancer and passed away, so we certainly remember her. She'll be handled by Williamson and Sons, and the obituary, their tribute has that if you want to read more about Leanne. But she was a wonderful person, and she visited with us a number of times, very sweet lady. So please remember her. And I ended up, we had busy days yesterday. Ash was going to the Rockwood, and I got a call from a friend down in Jacksonville, Alabama. He's preaching where Alan Webster used to preach at the Jacksonville congregation, and they were having a college youth day. And he called in a panic, and he goes, my speaker backed out at the last minute. Can you fill in? And I said, okay. And so I went to Jacksonville, Alabama yesterday and spoke twice down there. So it's been a busy weekend. It's been a busy week. I know everybody's tired, but this is the Lord's Day, and we're refreshed by that. So let's have a great Lord's Day and a great meal after our worship service. All right, chapter 2, beginning in verse 12, down through verse 18. Let's read it, and then we've got, I think, 4 questions today to answer. Verse 12, therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you both to will and to do his good pleasure. Do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain. Yes, and if I am being poured out as a drink offering on the sacrifice and service of your faith, I'm glad and rejoice with you all. For the same reason, you also be glad and rejoice with me. And this is, I hope you're, every time I get into this text, and of course I love the book of Philippians anyway, but every time I get into it I think, man, that's so powerful and that's so great. This is such a wonderful section. I hope you saw that as you were studying it this week. Just a wonderful compilation of thoughts right here. Okay, so here's the first question, number 1. Deals with verse 12. All right. What does Paul mean that the Philippians obeyed in my absence, or that they would obey in his absence? And what is the lesson here, and why do you think that it's so important for us to learn today? This is really powerful. What do you take away from that when he says that you obey in my absence? okay? And we'll get into this in just a moment. Do you think that there's often the tendency to do the right things only in the presence of other people? And what was Paul confident that they would do? That even if he wasn't there, what would they be doing? They're going to do the right thing even if he's not there. And I think that's a wonderful thing. In verse 12, when he says, before he says that they had that they were going to do this in my absence, he says this in verse 12, as you have always obeyed. What's that tell us about the general character of the Philippian church? They're a really faithful congregation, right? They've got their issues that they're dealing with, but they're a really faithful congregation. Tom, I see your hand.
Well, I just wondered if everybody remembers the old adage, when the cat's away, the mice will play.
Oh, yeah.
That's actually got some truth in it.
It does. It kind of deals with that principle of integrity, and that's kind of what I think we're talking about here. But Paul is talking about the consistently submissive character of this congregation. There was a desire on the saints in this church to honor Jesus and his word. And again, when we get to chapter 4, there's actually some internal problems. There's some infighting. It's not a widespread problem, but there is some problem in the church. And yet, in spite of the problem, Paul's able to say, you are an obedient congregation. You are a very faithful church. So as the congregation is concerned, it's devoted to doing the right thing. And when a congregation is like that, you can work through anything, which is why he's confident in them. But that's also part of what built Paul's confidence, and he's been talking about that. So let's get to that phrase, not as in my presence only, which is, as you said, a reference to if Paul was physically with them, right, that he's confident that they would do the right thing if he were physically with them, but he's also confident that they will do the same thing in his absence. And he'll talk about much more in my absence in this. That is a pretty standard phrase of Paul. He was very confident in people doing the right thing when he was not there. And sometimes he'll talk about people that they should do the right thing when he's not there. And you'll see, we've already seen it back in chapter 1. Look at chapter 1, verse 27. He said, only let your conduct be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent. So he'll often talk about the fact that he's not there, but that he encourages people to do the right thing even when he's not there. So Paul's point is that he did not have to be there for them to do the right thing. Okay, so let's get to the practical side of this. We've referenced it already. The Bible often speaks of integrity. It uses that idea, that concept of integrity. What is integrity? Okay, no matter who's watching, and sometimes if no one is watching, right? So doing the right thing should be what we do all the time, even if nobody's around to watch us. Of course, the Lord is always watching, but even if nobody's seeing us, right? The people that greatly encourage us, or the people that we certainly don't want to let down some folk, and we always act our best around them because we so admire them. But even in their absence, we're doing the right thing. And so there's this phrase that gets used in the New Testament. It's the word sincerity, which carries the concept of integrity. And I want to look at a couple of these. Look at Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12. Okay, look at verse 13, and then we'll read through verse 14. Then they sent to him some of the Pharisees and the Herodians to catch him in his words. And verse 14, when they had come, they said to him, Teacher, we know that you are true, that's the word there, and care about no one, for you do not regard the person of men, but teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? And the word here, true, is the word that means in the original sincere, or you have integrity. And they're appealing to his integrity. What they're saying is, we know that you always do the right thing. And because you always do the right thing, what's your take on taxes and paying tribute to Caesar? What they're trying to do is use his own integrity against him. And I know the word isn't used, but you remember there's another famous story in the Old Testament where they did the same thing. Remember when Daniel had been elevated to one of the presidents of the land, And there were some people who didn't like that he had that kind of power, and they plotted against him, and they said, let's get the king to make a law that if anybody prays, they'll be thrown in a den of lions. Because what did they know that Daniel would absolutely do? He would pray because he was a man of integrity. He's always going to do the right thing. That's the way they're using that against Jesus right here in this passage. All right, so go to 2 Corinthians chapter 1. 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Second Corinthians chapter 1. Look at verse 12. For our boasting is this, the testimony of our conscience that we conducted ourselves in the world in simplicity and godly sincerity. And the word sincerity there is the word that carries the concept of integrity. Not with fleshly wisdom, but with the grace of God, or by the grace of God, and more abundantly towards you. So Paul's saying, look, I know for a fact that when I conducted myself with you and everybody that I've had interaction with, there's been a lot of integrity there. I've done so that I'm being consistent, and I've always tried to do the right thing, and so that's the idea. That's what Paul is talking about in Philippians chapter 2. He doesn't use the word, but that's the concept he's appealing to, that they're going to do the right thing even if nobody else is watching, because that's what people with integrity do. And so we say that integrity is doing the right thing even when no one else is watching, because there's a tendency for some people to practice performance religion. And you got a great example of that in the New Testament in the Pharisees, because they pretended to be very righteous people. Read Matthew chapter 6 sometime and look at how Jesus talks about their almsgiving, and he talks about their prayers, how that they would stand and they would make loud prayers, and they would go on with repetitious words, and they would make sure that people watched them drop the money in the plate so that people would perceive how religious they were. The problem was their heart was not into what they were doing, and their heart was far from God. In fact, in Matthew 23 verse 3, Jesus would say, if they tell you to do something according to Moses' law, do it, but don't follow what they're doing, because they have no integrity. These are not people who are trustworthy. And then he uses the illustration about how that they are like whited sepulchres, right? They are like very beautifully adorned tombs, but on the inside they're just full of rotting bones and decaying flesh. That's what they were. And sometimes we're guilty of presenting a version of ourselves that isn't actually true, right? So you have the church version of self, and then you have a different version of self, and it should not be that way. We should be upright. We should be faithful saints. We should never pretend to be something that we're not. We shouldn't be a worldly person Monday through Saturday and guilty of being that, and then on Sunday there's a different version of ourselves. And Paul's saying, I know that there aren't two versions of yourself. You are consistent, and I think that's beautiful. Any thoughts on that in verse 12 about you're not going to be just in my presence only, but also my absence? Okay, question 2. What does Paul mean by work out your own salvation, and how does this connect to verse 13? What do you make of that? There are a lot of people who actually honestly have a problem with the way that's worded. Work out your own salvation. That's a really powerful statement. There's a lot of false teaching about works, and Paul is clearing the air here about works and salvation and how all that works. Any thoughts on that, Joel? Yes, it is. There's a personal responsibility. That's right. So there's actually two, Joel just mentioned it. There's two people at work here and in verse 12. In verse 13, who's working in verse 13? God is. So Barry said there's a lot of false teaching about working. I hear a lot of people in the world saying, God is working, God's doing this, God's doing that. But according to verse 12, who also has some responsibility to do something? We do. Okay? This is why, and I am fully convinced in His infinite eternal wisdom, the Spirit of God worded things in the Bible the way He did, because He's answering what He knew would be false doctrines about working and such. So first of all, He talks about work out your own salvation. This is present tense. The idea would be you keep on working it out. Interestingly, the word means you keep on working it down to a point, meaning that you keep on doing it until the time of not working is over with, right? When you are able to take that burden off, but you keep on doing it until then. Now, there's some conditions attached to it. We're going to keep on working, but we're going to work with fear and trembling. What do those words mean? What's fear? Respect. I heard respect. And then trembling is different because trembling means shaking caused by fear. It's actually trembling. It's quaking. And a great example of that would be in Mark 16, verse 8, when the ladies have gone to the tomb and the tomb was empty, and an angel speaks to them in all of his radiance and glory, and they turn away, and the word was used to describe the ladies. They were visibly, physically shaken by that event. It affected them. So he says, you keep on working out your salvation with respect or adoration and with the kind of shaking that is caused by fear, with trembling. And he says in verse 12, to work out your salvation. What depended upon them doing that? Their salvation. Interesting. So if your salvation depends upon a certain kind of working, can you be saved without that kind of work? No, you have to do it. And who's he writing to? People that are in need of conversion or Christians? So it sounds to me like even post-conversion, do you still have to keep on doing the right thing because does salvation depend upon keeping on doing the right thing? Right? So just because you're once saved doesn't mean you're always saved. So there's a lot of doctrine being corrected here in this passage. We'll talk about that in just a second. All right, so look at verse 13. Joel mentioned this. It is God who works in you both to will and to do His good pleasure. This is the encouragement part, right? So he tells them this is your duty in verse 12. Verse 13, this is your encouragement for doing the right thing, because he's letting them know that if they do the right thing, they've joined in cooperation with God in doing the right thing. So when he says it is God who works in you, he's saying they're not alone in their effort to do the right thing. God is working in them to help affect the same outcome, which is their salvation. And he does so through his word. That's mentioned here. When he says to will, which is talking about the will of God coupled with ours, and to do his good pleasure, which is what he delights in. And he tells us that through the word. So God gives us all the necessary strength through the word to do that, but we have to actually implement what he says to do. And we know from Romans 1:16 and some other passages that the Word of God is the power of God to salvation, and that's what's under consideration. You need to work out your own salvation. So let's pause now. I want to talk about this. Yes?
I kind of feel that when we talk about telling them to work out their own salvation, it's also to tell them, point out to them that their parents' salvation, their parents' belief in God
Yep.
is not theirs.
Yeah.
It doesn't fall over on them. You have to do your own.
Yeah, and he used the word own right here. It is a personal responsibility, and that's a great point. Too often we rely upon the strong faith of another person to pull us through, and it can't do that because we all have to work out our own salvation. That's a really good point. All right, so this is an important set of verses, as we mentioned, because in the overall discussion of work, this helps us sort through what kind of work is important and what kind of work doesn't count with God. There are many people in this world, that's what Barry was talking about earlier, there are a lot of people in this world who say, you can't work salvation. But the Bible says you must work salvation. So we've got to put them in the balance and say, okay, what works are invalid and what work does count, and whatever counts. This is what Paul is talking about. So there are some works in the Bible that are absolutely, thoroughly condemned by God. He just flat out says, these can't save you, okay? So here's one of them. One is the work of the law of Moses, and the Bible uses that. In the New Testament, it's often mentioned. So hold your place, go with me to Galatians chapter 2. Let's turn to Galatians 2. Galatians 2. If you've got time, read the whole book, because the whole book is dealing with this theme of whether they should be under the law of Moses or the law of Christ. That's the issue that Paul was dealing with in these churches. But look at verse 16. Knowing that a man is not justified by what? Works, but of what? Of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ, okay? So can a person today be justified by work from the law of Moses? Why not? It's been done away with, right? It's been nailed to the cross, been taken away. And interesting here in verse 16, if you read it carefully, he's not denying work, but a certain kind of work. He said you can't be justified by the work of the law of Moses, and if you're reading it correctly, but you can be justified by the work of what? Of the faith, which is the gospel, right? So he's talking about a different kind of a system of salvation. But works of the law of Moses are out. So if someone says, well, I would say you can't be justified by works of the law, I would agree with that because the Bible says that. You can't be justified by works of the law. There's another one. Go to Titus chapter 3. Titus chapter 3. Titus chapter 3. And look down at verse 5. Not by works of righteousness which we have done, but according to his mercy he saved us through the washing of regeneration and renewing of the Holy Spirit. Now, it's possible that there's still some connection to what we just talked about, but the idea would be works of self-righteousness, where I think that by doing it, I have somehow earned or I've placed God in debt to owe me salvation. And Paul is clearing that and said, nobody could ever do that. You can't put God in debt. It's never going to happen. That simply can't be the case. So there is some work in the Bible that is condemned, but in Philippians 2 and verse 12, he's clearly saying that work is an important part of our salvation. So what kind of work is that? It's just obedience. That's what we would refer to it as being. Go to James chapter 2. James chapter 2. Let's all turn to James 2. James 2. So remember back in Galatians, he said, you can't be justified by works of the law. And then he says, not by works of self-righteousness, right? Titus chapter 3 and verse 5. But look at James 2, look at verse 24. You see then that a man is justified by what? There's some people I know, they scrub that out of their Bible. They just take it right out of their Bible. He says you're justified by works and not by faith only, okay? But in the context of James 2, what kind of work is he talking about? He's just talking about obedience, right? Because look at the example. Look at the example, verse 21. Was not Abraham, our father, justified by works when he offered Isaac, his son, upon the altar? Who told him to do that? He's just obeying God. And then you have verse 25. Likewise, was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the message and sent them out another way? She was showing reverence and respect to God by doing that and helping God's people by doing that. This is talking about an obedient response to faith. So when Paul says in Philippians 2, verse 12, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, he's just talking about the obedient response of faith, but he clearly connects it to salvation. The best example I know to explain it all is in Luke chapter 17. So turn to Luke 17. One more passage and then we'll move on. Luke 17. Luke 17. Look at verse 5 beginning. I know he doesn't use the word, but the concept is here. So look at verse 5 beginning. I love this. It's an excellent explanation of how this all works. Verse 5, the apostle said to the Lord, increase our faith. All right, here we go, verse 6. The Lord said, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you can say to this mulberry tree, be pulled up by the roots and be planted by the sea, and it would obey you. Which of you, having a servant plowing or tending sheep, will say to him when he's come in from the field, come at once and sit down to eat? But will not rather say to him, prepare something for my supper, and gird yourself and serve me till I've eaten and drunk, and afterwards you'll eat and drink? Does he thank the servant because he did the things that were commanded him? I think not. Now watch verse 10. So likewise you, when you have done all those things which are commanded. So that's the first part of it. Are we required to do the things that God commands us to do? We are required to do that. But now watch. Say, we are unprofitable servants. We have done what was our duty to do. It is our duty to do the things that God tells us to do. But in the end, once we've done it all, what are we in the end? We're still unprofitable servants. We haven't put God in debt to us by doing that. We've simply done what is our duty to do. So Paul is reminding those in Philippi to do that. Work is a requirement of a Christian. Their salvation was in the balance. It depended upon their constant dependent obedience to the will of God. That's what he's talking about. All right, number 3. Let's see, number 3. Do you think complaining and disputing are problems even today in the church. And what is Paul's argument about these problems in verses 14 through 16? What do you think about this? When he says, do all things without complaining and disputing. What do you think about that? What's the connection here? Yeah, and there was. When you get to chapter 4, there's clearly two ladies that are arguing with each other, but he says, stop your complaining and stop your disputing. Complaining here means grumbling or muttering or displeasure. Does that ever happen in the church? Yeah. Disputing means questioning or literally rationalizing in an evil sense. It could even include the idea of doubt, right? So the idea would be, in context, he's saying, as you work out your own salvation, don't complain about it, and don't evil surmise against the will of God in doing that. But we understand the more broad connection to the relationships in the church. And it's in the greater context of unity, because he's still pointing toward that back in chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. Our service to God should be our greatest joy, never our deepest regret. That's what Paul is telling them. So he admonishes them in verse 15 that you become blameless and harmless, right? That you're free from fault. Keep your life free of that. Harmless means pure, innocent, unmixed. That's the solution to what they would grumble and complain against. Because they're children of God without fault, meaning that their lives aren't continually marred by sin. And they live, and I love the language here, they live in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. Not a whole lot has changed on that. They're supposed to be lights in the world. That's what Jesus was talking about, being a light in the world. And they're supposed to hold fast the word of life, which is the gospel. So that Paul's desire would be that if they did this, and the grumbling and the complaining would keep them from that, if they could set that aside and just focus on the work. In the end, Paul said, that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I've not run in vain or labored in vain, meaning that you'll receive eternal reward at the end. And Paul's saying, for that I will be thankful. So let's talk about murmuring and complaining for just a little bit. I think there's two sides to that, right? In a congregation, there's two sides to it. We either complain and grumble about the very will of God, and I think that's probably more directly what Paul's talking about here, that they would complain about what God would require them to do, which they weren't. But sometimes we do that. For example, do you think some people grumble and complain about what God wants people to do in attendance? Like if you say you need to attend church services, why? I can't. And they grumble about that, right? And some people do that. Or if God is saying, go to all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, people kind of get aggravated about that. Surely he's not asking me to take time out of my busy schedule to go do that. And they get aggravated by that requirement, or to study, or to pray, or to arrange our priorities where he's first. Sometimes we grumble and complain about that. So there is sometimes complaint against the will of God. I think a lot of times, though, the complaining is about each other. We grumble about each other. Elders get complained about and they get grumbled against. Preachers get grumbled about and complained about. Leaders of worship get complained about. Bible class teachers get complained about. Activities get complained about. Personalities get complained about. And, you know, I always think, and I could be just as guilty of that as anybody. I've got to be really careful that I don't do it. But generally speaking, the people who do the most complaining in a congregation are usually the people who are most detached from congregational life and from the church. They're usually struggling with faithfulness, and so they're griping and quipping at each other. But we do that, and almost all complaining stems from a lack of our own involvement in the Lord's service. And when Paul is saying, be blameless and be harmless and be faultless in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, that takes effort and time. Paul's literally saying, if you invest yourself into the truth, you won't have time to murmur and complain about the word. But sometimes we grumble and complain. Is Paul saying here that legitimate constructive criticism is not allowed? Could we all use constructive criticism from time to time? It's hard. None of us like it because it means we have to change. We have to be honest and assess ourselves. That's not easy. But complaining here is just arbitrary, just mere complaint against the uncomfortableness of doing the right thing. And that's what he's talking about. Any thoughts on that? Yep. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. 100%. And he's not legislating against that for sure, and I think that's a good point. All right, number 4. He ends this section on a really beautiful word picture. So, number 4, based on Paul's word picture in chapter 2, verses 17 and 18, how should we view life? What is the word picture here, by the way? What's he using? The sacrifice. And the specific is the what? The drink offering, the pouring out of a drink offering. What on earth is that? Where'd that come from? It's an Old Testament concept, right? When he says to be poured out as a drink offering. At least twice in the New Testament Paul does that. The other time is in 2 Timothy 4, verse 6. When he says of his life, he says, I'm already being poured out as a drink offering. It is an Old Testament word picture where the drink offering was poured out in connection to certain sacrifices. And you see that. They would pour out the drink offering as the offering was being made, which meant it was the end of that offering's life. And so Paul is saying, if I'm required to sacrifice my life because of your commitment to God, your faith, then I'm glad to do it. And then he does a vice versa, because in verse 18 he said, for the same reason, you also be glad and rejoice with me, meaning that if you have to sacrifice your life for my faith, you should be glad to do that as well. What is our life ultimately to God? Look at Romans 12. Let's go to Romans 12. Romans chapter 12. We normally read verses 1 and 2. We'll just read verse 1. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a what? A living sacrifice. We are, in our body, a sacrifice to God. To what extent might that sacrifice be called? Even if you have to die for it. We might be called to sacrifice our life to be faithful to God, or for the faithfulness of another person. And Paul's saying, if I'm required to pour out my life as a drink offering, which is a way of saying, if I'm required to give my life for your faith, I'm willing to do it. And then he said, and vice versa, you should be willing to do the same for me, because our lives are a sacrifice to God. That's the extent to which our lives should be offered. And there's a reason for that. In 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 20, Paul says, you are not your own. You've been bought with a price. We belong to somebody else now. And if it's required of us, we should think of it that way. And I don't know that we often do, but that's the way we should view life. Any thoughts on Philippians 2, verses 12 through verse 18? Wonderful, wonderful section. All right, so coming up, if you'll grab a copy of those notes and take a look at them before next week, there's 2 companions that Paul writes about, and their goings on. One is Timothy, the other is Epaphroditus. And we're going to find out what happens with Timothy and Epaphroditus next week. It's probably one of our longer sections, but we have, I think, 3 or 4 questions from verses 19 through 30. But it won't take as long, right? It'll be the same amount of time to go through it. We'll accomplish it in one class. But we'll find out what's going on with Timothy and about his character, and what Paul says about Epaphroditus and why Epaphroditus should be praised as well as Timothy, and how they should view faithful men like that. All right, let's put a peg in it here. Thank you guys so much for your input today. Appreciate it. Thank you.